Hey, Kayla, we are so glad to have you on the Sisterhood today. Welcome.
Honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we were just chatting. You're a mama of three boys, which I love so much because you know that mirrors our family. We have three boys and a girl, and we were just talking about the fun that comes with. Does the noise ever get to you?
Oh, totally. I'll go in
Uh-huh.
my room and lock the door and just tell them I need a minute. I need a timeout. I need
Yeah.
like silence. It's like the YouTube and the video games and the wrestling, and it's just constant. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
constant noise.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so fun. And you are in California. Love another West Coaster. And tell people a little bit about just, your schooling and what you're doing right now with that.
Yeah, so me and my boys are all doing virtual learning. They're doing virtual learning for first and second grade from home, and then my little one's at preschool. And then I am doing grad school. I just started a grad school program last week, and because of COVID, it's all virtual too. So we do school with them during the day, and then I put them to bed, and then I have school 3 nights a week. So our life is super full, but it's good. We're good, and my boys are happy, and we're rebuilding this beautiful life.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your story over the last, 5 years and just what that has looked like for you.
Sure. Yeah, so 5 years ago, I would say that I was living my dream life. Like I had everything I could have ever wished for, dreamed for, or asked for, and more. I was married to my dream guy. We were leading a large, thriving, growing church. He was the lead pastor of the church, and we had these three little boys. And life was good. Life was good. We knew where we were headed. If someone would have asked me what my life would have looked like in 20 years, I would have easily answered like living at the same house, serving in ministry, married to the same guy, raising the same kids. Like it was so easy to predict what the next 20 years of my life would have looked like. And I loved my life. I loved being a pastor's wife. I loved serving in the church with him. I was passionate about it. And then in the fall of 2017, my husband started experiencing panic attacks. And really, he had about 7 years of ministry where he ran fast, he ran hard, he had stepped up to the plate in a lot of ways when his father, who was the lead pastor of the church, was diagnosed with leukemia. And so he'd been running fast and running hard and became the lead pastor during that time. And we welcomed three boys into our home during that time. And so his body, I think, was just exhausted. So started experiencing panic attacks in the fall of 2017, and they continued into the spring of 2018. And in April of 2018, there was a massive panic attack that landed him in the hospital. And we all just said, like, enough is enough. It's time for him to take a break. It's time for him to go on sabbatical. It's time for us to figure out what is going on inside of his body. We can't live like this anymore. He can't live like this anymore. He's exhausted. We got to figure out what's going on. So he went on this sabbatical. A few weeks later, he had a psychiatrist appointment, and that's when he was diagnosed with depression. And he was relieved to have a diagnosis. He was relieved to finally understand what was going on inside of his body. And the
Hmm.
doctors were really hopeful that he was on the low end of the spectrum. They gave him some medication. They thought with rest and time off work and this medication and therapy that he would bounce right back and he'd be back to work in no time. And so for that summer in 2018, we rested, and he wrestled with depression. And a lot of days I didn't know who I was going to get coming out of the bedroom in the morning. I didn't know if he would be happy or sad or angry, or if he would just want to hang out and be busy and do yard work and play with the kids. Like I really never knew who I was going to get. And so it was a hard, exhausting summer. And I was also taking care of these three boys. By July that year, the doctors actually thought he was getting better. And so they released him to go back to work. So on August 1st, 2018, he hit the ground running, returned to work, gave two powerful messages on mental illness, talked about depression, talked about suicide, gave out statistics from the NAMI website, gave out the suicide hotline number. He knew the facts. He would have known where to go for help. Headed into the third week, he had his message ready for Sunday. He was excited about it. He even posted this little video to Instagram, like, love the sounds and the views from my home study. Like, he loved his job. He loved our life. He loved what he was doing. He had a really bad day in the office that week, and unfortunately he was just not able to recover. So we quickly realized, like, he's not well. We need to take a step back. Maybe he shouldn't have gone back to work. And so while we were away from him for a little bit, trying to figure out the next steps for his healing, he attempted suicide. And we were completely shocked, completely stunned. Like, we really, truly did not see it coming. The doctors did not see it coming. Like, this was not supposed to happen to him. Just the week before, he was giving out the suicide hotline number from the stage. Like, this was
Right.
not supposed to happen to him.
Wow.
So he was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors ran a bunch of tests, and unfortunately there was nothing they could do. And so on August 25th, 2018, he died and went to be with Jesus. And I was handed a brand new life as a widow and now single mom of 3 very young boys.
Mm. It's just such a hard story. I mean, for you to not know that it could turn out that way, and even if you did know, it wouldn't help anyway, but still to have that shock and that, I mean, tell us a little bit about what that felt like, to feel like you know someone, but then you really don't, you don't know those inner workings.
Yeah, there was one time that Andrew tried to tell me. I'll never forget. It was that summer. It was after a long, busy day with the kids, and we were sitting at the kitchen counter, and after the kids had gone to bed. And I was sharing my frustration, my exhaustion just from that
Mm-hmm.
season. And he was sharing his frustration and exhaustion too. And he told me that he was up in the middle of the night before and had papers strewn all over the kitchen counter and was trying to figure out his staff organization chart for when he went back to work. And he thought about killing himself. And I'll never forget my reaction to that admission. I told him, that is the most selfish thing you could ever do. Like, you would never do that to us. Did you Google it? Like, why would you say that? Like, I completely reacted out of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And his response to my reaction was, Kayla, that is not what you say to someone that tells you that they're struggling with suicide. Like, you need to come up with something better to say. And I really, truly put it off the table. I really, truly thought that would never happen to him. He would never do that to our family. He would never hurt me like that. He would never hurt himself like that. I really, truly believed that that would never happen, but it did. And so my main regret, and what I like to share in conversations like this, is if somebody tells you that they are struggling with suicide, it is not a time to react out of your own emotion. It is a time to lean in and to ask questions like, do you have a suicide plan? What problem are you trying to solve through suicide? When and how would you do it? What is your dream idea of suicide? And asking those questions and leaning in and listening and sitting beside them and trying to crawl into that dark space with them and really listen and be a safe space for him. I think because of that one time that didn't go well, that he did share that with me, I wasn't that safe space for him anymore. He never brought it up again. And I never asked about it again because I really, truly believed that it would never happen.
Mm. That's hard for a wife, I would think, because as you said, you automatically went to, this is how this would impact me and our kids, and you can't do that. And so it almost would be easier for somebody who is 1 step, 2 steps removed from the person to be able to have that empathetic response, because the suicide wouldn't impact somebody else in the same way that it would impact you as a spouse. And I talk to a lot of women whose husbands struggle with depression, especially when kids are little. I think husbands all of a sudden feel this pressure to provide, and often their careers are going up and they're in stressful places at work. And women are taking on more at home to protect their kids, I think, from dad's struggles, but also to take some of the burden off of their husbands so that they can get healthy. So as women are holding all of that and they hear something like you did, What would you say in that moment is a way to transition from, oh, no, no, no? I mean, that would be my response. No, you can't talk like that. We have children to raise and you have a family you're responsible for. How do you transition in that, if it is your spouse or if it is somebody whose life you are very interconnected to, your child or your parent, or you would be so impacted by it? Can you speak to that person who is so closely connected, how you separate your own fear and your own angst in that moment?
Any talk of suicide has to be taken seriously. Like anytime anybody talks about killing themselves or hurting themselves or any kind of suicidal ideation, like it has to be taken seriously. And so I think understanding that can help us zoom out in that moment. Like, okay, they're saying the word suicide, or they're talking about hurting themselves. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is a time for me to open up my ears and open up my eyes and really, truly try to listen and really, truly try to see them. I think the hardest part of having a spouse that's struggling with mental illness is differentiating between the person that you married and the person that's sick. So there was like healthy Andrew and there was sick Andrew. And it was really hard for me a lot of the time to know who I was talking to, because some days he would be fine and some days he would be normal. And then other days he would not, and he'd be completely off. And it'd be like I'm talking to a completely different person. And so I think knowing that in that moment, that is not your person. Like in that moment, like they are sick and they're crying out for help and they're like asking you to throw them a life preserver. Like they are trying to share, they're trying to be brave and they're trying to share these deep, dark thoughts that they have. And so it's a moment to lean in and to listen and to ask questions, and all those emotions that you're struggling with, like all of those are real. And I think instead of processing those emotions with your person, saving those emotions for a different safe space with maybe a close friend or a family member or a therapist, because with the person that's sick, that's admitting those thoughts, they're not going to be able to handle your emotions. Like they need you to be a present, safe space for them in that moment. As like selfless, that's hard because it's very selfless. But I think being aware of like, this isn't a time for me to share how I'm feeling. This is a time for me to listen. And I have real, true feelings, but I can take those to a therapist. Or right after this conversation, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to step outside and I'm going to make a phone call and talk to somebody about it because I'm terrified. So I think just, yeah, being aware of that reality of like, it's time to listen and lean in, and maybe it's not a time to react out of your own emotion.
Can you talk to us about even how to approach conversations with whether it's a spouse or a child? And I know there's different strategies for both because, it's one's an adult, one's not. But can you help us to understand even how, if a parent or a spouse is suspecting that their loved one is struggling with depression or another type of mental illness, how do you approach that? Because I do feel like there's still, I think we've come so far. I really do. I think we've come so far, but there's still a little bit of a stigma around mental illness. And that person can easily go into shame and not want to reveal how they really are feeling or what's really happening because it's scary to them and they don't want other people judging them. So just help us with that whole thing.
I think our approach to all of that matters. The way that we approach somebody, the way that we bring that up, the way that that surfaces. I think maybe even going first, like sharing your own struggles first, and maybe you're sharing your own experience with pain, or maybe you've walked through a season of depression or anxiety or suicidal ideation, like sharing that first and kind of setting the stage for them to be able to share their story too, or share their pain too. I think asking questions instead of assuming. So instead of assuming that they're feeling a certain way or assuming that they must fit this criteria, like asking questions, offering to go to the therapy appointment with them. Like, hey, I'm going to make a therapy appointment. You want to go with me? Like, I think it would be great if you want to go with me, or let's go together. One of my biggest regrets with Andrew is not treating it as a team as much as we should have. I wish I would have gone with him to every single appointment. I think it's very difficult for somebody that's struggling to even articulate how they're feeling. And so it's our job as their loved one to help them, to help give them a voice, to help them articulate how they're feeling, to help them open up. And we can do that by asking questions and by being vulnerable ourselves.
That's really good and helpful. And I think that whole idea of just, I'm with you, right? That's so powerful, that whole idea of I'm with you. And yet, can you speak to that idea that also, even though you're with them, you're not in control of outcome? And I imagine that's been a big part of your healing and therapy as you've moved from that time where he died just into now, of just how have you worked through that ultimately people are in charge of their own decisions.
Yeah, that can be a really, really hard reality to grapple with, because especially with suicide, because you would have done anything that you could possibly do to save them. Like even his friends that like live in Australia were like, they like wish they would have done more. And so I think, releasing that control, and you can do only what you can do. At the end of the day, I did the best that I could do for Andrew. As a mom of 3 young kids and trying to take care of him, and my small knowledge of mental health, like I really did the best that I could do in that season. But it is hard. And I think being able to say that out loud, like I tried my best and I did the best that I can do, and releasing that, like I can't control their emotions. I can't control their actions. I don't get to control the way that their mind works. And there's this little phrase that my mother-in-law actually shared in a message that we did. We actually gave Andrew's last message together a few months after he passed away. We got on stage and gave that last message that he
Oh my
wrote.
gosh, that's amazing.
It was so special and a really healing part of our journey. But she shared this phrase in the message, and the phrase was, I have no idea. Those 4 words, I have no idea, are so powerful. Like we really, truly have no idea what it's like to walk in anybody else's shoes but our own. Mm-hmm. And so I think at the end of the day, remembering that, like, I have no idea what it was like for Andrew to live with what he was living with. I have no idea what those moments leading up to the suicide must have felt like for him. I have no idea about his deep inner pain that only he would know. And so I think at the end of the day, just realizing like we only know our own perspective and our own reality, and we can try our best to ask questions and to lean in and to be present in other people's pain. But at the end of the day, we truly have no idea what it's like to walk in anybody else's shoes but our own.
It's really that. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, I'm interested in knowing when that happened. You were shocked, but probably people in your church were shocked. Everybody was surprised that he took it to that level. I mean, I guess people knew he was on sabbatical and that maybe he was struggling. And if his sermons right before had been about mental health, if he'd shared some of his story, maybe it wasn't as shocking as just out of the blue. But what was helpful in how people responded to you, and what was not helpful specifically around it being a suicide?
Yeah. I was actually pleasantly surprised with the way that the world responded. Our story went viral. Young, good-looking guy, young family. Our family picture was like spread around the world. And all of a sudden, yeah, all of a sudden, we're the sad story on the internet. Mm-hmm. It was so strange. It was such a strange reality. But for the majority, the response was so kind and so loving and so compassionate. The church even set up a GoFundMe campaign that did really well. Like people were leaning in, and they were wanting to pray for our family and give to our family. We received thousands of letters in the mail from people of encouragement and sharing their stories. People at the church wrote letters to my boys about their dad and what they loved about their dad. And so
Wow.
the response was so loving and so kind, which I know isn't always the case with suicide. And so I was so grateful that the response was the way that it was. On the other hand, there were things that people said, and I think for the majority of it, it's just the misunderstanding and the misconceptions and the myths surrounding suicide. And some of those myths are that if somebody dies by suicide, then they don't go to heaven. So people were upset that I was saying that he went to be with Jesus, or that he's in heaven now and he's free from pain. Like, wait a second. Didn't he die by suicide? Don't you, like, isn't it a straight ticket to hell if you die by suicide? And so my response to that in my journey these last few years is having those hard conversations and talking about that and going there. And, you know, I thought that too. I had that misconception too. When we were in the hospital and he was dying, I leaned over the hospital bed to my mother-in-law and I said, is he going to go to heaven? Because I had thought that misconception too. I was under that myth as well. And her response to me was, Kayla, like, our acceptance into eternity does not hinge on how we die. It hinges on our relationship with Jesus. And so I'm so confident of that now, that it hinges on our relationship with Jesus. And the way that, I don't think the way that Andrew died was God's plan A for Andrew. I think it's an absolute tragedy. It wasn't even Andrew's plan A for Andrew. And so what's helpful to me, and even the suicide is selfish is another big myth. And what's been helpful to me with both of those things is that in that moment that the suicide happened, it was not Andrew. Andrew was gone. Andrew wasn't present. His mind was sick. He wasn't even able to access the rational part of his mind. His psychiatrist told us afterwards that 90% of suicides are impulsive. It's literally an in the moment, overwhelming pain, an overwhelming pain where the only way to make the pain go away seems like dying. Like dying feels like the only way to make the pain go away. And so that's helped me just have compassion and empathy for Andrew and his pain, and that this is not something that he chose. I really do not believe that the suicide is something that he chose. I think if he were here today, he would be just as shocked as the rest of us that this happened. Like, I really do not believe he saw this coming, just like the rest of us did not see it coming.
That's interesting. That aligns. We had a mental health series. It was it two Mays ago during the mental health month?
Yeah.
And anyway, we had an expert on talking about it. And she said something very similar. She said that I think it was 90% of attempted suicide victims, the moment they do it, they regret it. So, you know, that very minute, literally, when they're, and obviously those are the ones that survive because they're able to report back and say that. But that they, you know, it's like you're saying, it's like this overwhelming sense of I have to escape. But then the moment they do that, they actually regret doing it.
They don't want to die. They just want their pain to go away. That's the struggle with suicide, is that you know that they did not want to die. And so when they do die, you're left to grapple with, like, oh my gosh, this person loved their life. They loved our family. They loved what they were doing. Like, they did not want to die, but they did. It's so hard. It's so hard to grapple with that.
So I think the question that listeners may be having, because this is the question going through my mind, is if it tends to be impulsive, if it tends to be this overwhelming grief or pain or anxiety that they are trying to overcome, how do we have conversations with people who may be headed in that direction, but we don't know that they're headed to that extreme direction and they don't know? So we may ask them in the moment, how are you feeling? Is everything okay? But 2 hours later, a day, a week later, they may be experiencing this overwhelming sense. How do we have conversations that are productive, that are anticipating the possibility, even if they're not feeling that in the moment, because likely they're not?
I think getting comfortable with the word suicide I think the word suicide stirs up a lot of emotions of uncomfortability in us. We don't like that word. I did not like that word when my husband brought it up, and even when the psychiatrist and the therapist asked about it in our meetings, like, I did not like that word before, and now it's part of my regular vocabulary. I have conversations like this all the time. And so I think getting comfortable with that word suicide and being willing to say that word out loud, having those conversations beforehand with the person that's struggling, like, hey, have you ever thought about suicide? Asking that question all the time, like it's a normal question, like, how are you today? Like, have you ever thought about suicide? Are you struggling with suicidal thoughts today? If you ever are struggling with that, like, I am a safe space for you. You can call me anytime, in the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning. Like, if you are ever thinking about taking your own life, like, I am here for you, and I will come be with you, and I will come sit with you. I think helping people know that they have safe people, that they have safe spaces, that there's people that are willing to crawl into that dark space with them. And I think getting comfortable with that word suicide.
Yeah, I've also heard that, like you were saying, a concrete plan that is not based in the prefrontal cortex, but actually is based in a part of the brain where they can access. Because, like you were saying, in our moments of trauma, it's hard to access the reasoning part of our brain, right? So having like a concrete conversation that is, you have them really, repeat back to you a plan. If they are considering suicide, that they actually have a concrete plan. Like, I call this person, I reach out to, this is my emergency person. And when I'm in that thought, I call that person. It's interesting, but I've heard that that's a very effective strategy for that, especially with kids.
Well, that makes
So good.
sense. It makes sense to have that go-to if you are not in your right mind, essentially. If you are not able to be thinking clearly and you're overcome with emotion. I mean, we have some friends here in the Denver area whose son committed suicide last year at school, and everyone was shocked, just shocked. His roommate left, and an hour later, somebody found him, and he seemed fine that morning. And so to think, I mean, in some ways, I think that makes people feel more anxious, because when we hear, oh, this person's really struggling, there were all these warning signs, then we can appease ourselves and say, well, my person is fine. My person would never do that, has not shown any of those warning signs. So when we hear that, it tends to be this impulsive and can be a surprise. It makes a lot of us panic because we think, oh, well, then maybe there is something I should be worried about. And so I think having that conversation ahead of time of saying, if you ever have these thoughts or these impulses, let's come up with a plan, feels like a really concrete step that the person can cling to, but then the people that love that person can feel, okay, maybe there is something we can help on the preventive end to do. And of course, finding somebody, all of the mental health services that they need and medication that they need, and all of that is always helpful too. And can you speak to that, Kayla, about maybe just normalizing people getting professional help and getting medical help? Because I think in the church, we did have that series, but we just don't talk about it enough and normalize it, like normalizing the word suicide, just normalizing antidepressants and professional help. Can you talk about how we can help create that culture within our circles of influence?
That's a huge part of your healing. If you're struggling with depression, or you're struggling with anxiety, or if you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, like, you have to tell your therapist, you have to tell your doctor, and you don't need to feel shame about sitting in a psychiatrist's office and having that conversation with the psychiatrist. They're only going to prescribe you medication if they think you need it. They're not going to give it to you if they don't think you need it. And so Yeah, I think even in our close friend circles, like talking about medication and normalizing medication and asking like, hey, we thought about maybe going to see a psychiatrist about this. Have we thought about maybe some antidepressants or some anti-anxiety medication? Have you thought about how that might be helpful for you just for a season? It doesn't have to be a long-term thing. Some people are on it for years and that's how they function. And for a lot of people, it's just a season. It's just 6 months to a year and they're able to phase off of it. And it really is helpful. Like studies have shown that it really, really is helpful. And it can help people come back from that deep, dark depression, come back to just normal stability. And over time, maybe they can transition off of it and they can be there. But I think, yeah, just normalizing it and talking about it and having those conversations and suggesting it, and that it's not this big, evil, scary thing, but that it's actually something that can be really helpful. Like when you have a headache and you're overcome with pain and you have a migraine, like you take medication, like you take Advil or you take aspirin, to get your headache to go away. And it can be like that with depression and anxiety and other mental health issues too. Like it's there to help you. And you also have to do the rest of the work too. Like it's just part of it. But also part of it is therapy and conversations and having those safe people and exercise and eating well and doing all the other things. But medication, yes, is definitely like a very valid part of the journey. And it was a part of the journey for my husband. And a lot of people, what's so interesting is that is also a question I get from a lot of people, like, was he taking medication? What medication was he on? And there's still a stigma that just the side effects of the medication, and people blame the medication after a suicide and say it was the medication and it's that's why they died. And I think sometimes the side effects for the medication are very scary and very real. And I watched how the medication did change my husband in some ways. So I think being honest, if you are taking medication, are you thinking about taking medication, being honest with your psychiatrist and telling them how it's really affecting you and those thoughts that you're really having and those emotions that you're really experiencing. And for the loved one that's living in the home with the person that's taking the medication, I think going to the psychiatrist appointment with them and advocating for them and telling the psychiatrist like how they're really behaving at home. I think for us, my husband wasn't really able to be honest with the psychiatrist. Honestly, I think he wanted the psychiatrist to like him. And I didn't go with him to many psychiatrist appointments, but they were pretty quick in and out. And they talked about a lot of other things. They would talk about his passion for ministry in India and the church, and didn't really talk about the mental health stuff as much. So I wish I would have gone to every appointment and said, hey, he's acting this way at home, or he mentioned suicide. Like, is this normal? Is this a side effect from the medication? Should we tweak anything? It is a journey with the medication. And oftentimes there's a lot of shifts and changes before they find the right balance with all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've even known people that have kept diaries, and that's been helpful when they've been on medication or their child has been on medication. They've kind of just kept a journal in the kitchen and they just kind of journal like what's happening. And then they can bring that in to the physician and say, this is kind of what's going on. This is the day-to-day of what this looks like. So I thought that was a good way to keep track of it. Because sometimes that's a really nebulous thing. Like, well, I kind of feel this way, but it's hard. It's hard to kind of wrap around that because it's emotions, and emotions are subjective, and, it's highs and lows, and those come and go. And so having an actual log at least puts some kind of concrete, like, scientific part to it that you can go back to. So Kayla, I want to touch on a little bit. If someone's listening and they're thinking to themselves, I myself might be really struggling here, what would you recommend? How best should they reach out to someone, and where do they start if they're struggling with that?
I would start with your close circle of friends. If you have a close circle of friends, of people that you can be honest with and that you can trust, I think being being willing to be vulnerable and sharing how you're really feeling, and in those safe spaces. And I think the next step after that would be a therapist. And if you don't have a therapist, Psychology Today is a great place to log on. You can put in your insurance information and your zip code, and they can find a psychologist near you. So therapy, talking to your friends, I think just being willing to be honest with how you're feeling, and not brushing it off as a bad day or a series of bad days, or maybe it's just going to go away. I think it can be really easy to have a day. I know for myself in my journey with grief in these last few years of what I've walked through in this deep, overwhelming pain, I've had days where I've struggled with suicidal ideation because my pain is so overwhelming that suicide feels like the only way out. And so when I do pick up the phone, I call a friend and say, hey, I'm struggling with this today. I'm okay. I know I'm not going to act on it, but I need to tell somebody. Like I can't keep this to myself. I need to tell somebody. And then the next step is to call the therapist and tell them to, hey, I'm struggling with this, and I know that I need to tell somebody, because those things, those real thoughts and that pain, if kept in the dark, and if you keep it to yourself and you don't share it with anybody, I think that's when it grows. I think when you bring it out to the light and you share those emotions with others and you share that pain with others, you're actually inviting other people into that pain, and it's able to be brought into the light.
Really helpful. That's great. The last question I want to ask you today is, how have you personally dealt with the grief of suicide? And, there's a lot of levels to it, I know, and I know it's deep and complicated, and that every person, grief is individual. So I realize when I ask you that question, you can only speak to your grief, but I think, that it's just helpful to hear. I mean, how have you put one foot in front of the other? I mean, you have 3 boys you have to take care of, and you're dealing with your own deep, deep, deep loss. And so talk to us just about even how you walk through grief when you've had something that devastating happen.
Right away, I put my 3 boys in school. So I put all 3 of them into a private Christian school full time, like 8:30 to 4:30 every day. So they would have routines, so they would have friends, so they would have people that care for them, so that I could have space to grieve. I knew that if I didn't do that, I would not be a good mom, and I would not be able to have that space and be that safe space for them too that they needed. And so I did that right away. And honestly, that was a huge part of my healing, just to have that space during the day to do what I needed to do. And in a lot of ways, for the first few years, I really let my pain and let my grief lead me. And so if my grief was leading me to the cemetery that day, I drove to the cemetery, and I would sit there and I would cry and I would walk around and until that pole went away. If my grief led me to the beach, to this favorite lifeguard tower that Andrew and I had the first time that he said he loved me, at this lifeguard tower at the beach, then I would go and I would sit there and watch the waves crash on the beach and pray and spend time with God. I also did therapy. I went to therapy for an hour every single week for the first year and a half. And that was a huge part of my healing journey, just having that space with a professional to talk about my pain and talk about my feelings and talk about the trauma, and relive a lot of that. I think that's the thing with suicide, is for the first 2 months, my mind just relived it over and over and over and over and over again. What the therapist told me is that my brain had nowhere to put it, and that it was going to take time for my brain to create a file folder for all of that trauma to go into. And so while it was all at the forefront of my mind and just swirling around in my brain, I was reliving it all of the time. And the thing about suicide is that my mind would literally try to save him. So my mind came up with millions of different ways that I should have saved him, could have saved him, ways that he would still be alive. And it's torturous, middle of the night, all day during the day. It's exhausting. One suggestion from a friend early on was to have at least an hour during the day where you give yourself a break from the grief. So whether that's watching a TV show or reading a book or talking to a friend about something else, or going for a walk or going to the movies, like giving yourself a break, because it is this all-consuming, overwhelming thing. I think the biggest thing that's been healing for me is just running to the pain. I am running to the pain. I am embracing the pain. I am stepping toward the pain. I am welcoming the pain. I'm welcoming all those emotions that come with the pain, and that all of those things are for my healing. You know, like the anger is for my healing. The frustration is for my healing. The sadness is for my healing. And so welcoming all of those feelings and allowing them to do their work inside of me, and then letting them go.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for sharing that. And that is so helpful, really helpful. And I always go back to, we had an interview with a woman named Linda Lawrence Hunt, and she wrote a book about grief and loss. And she interviewed countless families that have actually lost a child. And she just says some of the most interesting things. And I would recommend any listener to go back and listen to. So we did 2 interviews with her. The first one was How to Journey Through Grief and Loss, which I just think is one of our best interviews ever. And it was early on. But she says that there is joy underneath pain. If you can authentically get through the pain, you can find the deep joy that bubbles forth, springs forth almost, that actually the pain creates more joy and deeper joy if you can get underneath it. But to get underneath it, you have to walk through that fire. And that's a really painful and hard process, but that there's no skipping it, right? There's no, like, you can't get to that joy unless you've actually gone through that fire of pain.
Right. That's beautiful.
Well, Kayla, thank you so much for sharing your story and for just being courageous enough to tell it, because I think it is, this isn't probably something you ever wanted to talk about, thought you would be talking about. It goes back to the beginning of the interview. This wasn't supposed to be your life. And so for you to use this and to help others and to shine light on mental illness and suicide is so important. It's such important work that you're doing, and yet one that I know is exhausting. So thank you for your courage to do that. Do you have any last words for listeners?
Just if you're struggling with depression, or you're struggling with suicidal ideation and you haven't told anybody, that now is your chance to tell somebody. Now is your chance to reach out, call somebody today, make the appointment with a therapist today. Your life is worth living, and we want you to stay here. And you have a sea of people around you that love you, that are there for you, and that want to be there for you.
Mm-hmm. So great. Thank you, Kayla. We sure appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.